How y'all doing? It's Coach Renz over here. And I know a lot of y'all, a lot of people making comments, on different videos, and they're saying that, well, you left Christianity over, you left Yahweh and you left the Lord, Yeshua, over small details, over insequential details, translation, mistranslation by man and language, things of that nature. Well, I want you to stay to the end of this one. The reason why I want you to stay to the end of it is because, yes, I'm going to utilize some of the actions that man has taken based on their understanding of this Bible at different time frames, one particular time frame and one particular subject matter. But understand that this one particular subject matter, them being able to utilize it, is based on your book. It's the literal translation of your book of what you can do when it comes to this subject matter of slavery. That's right. Slavery has always been one of those reasons why I choose definitely to walk away from this religion. It had absolutely nothing to do with somebody hurting me. I really wish I would stop that. The hurt, the true hurt. Let me break this down very quick. This is the true hurt that causes many of us to walk away. Yeah, hey, the true hurt is the fact that our parents, that our social community leaders, that our grandparents, our uncles, our aunties, those people that we trusted from birth, conditioned us into a religion that once we began to study it and realize the inaccuracies, realize the errors, realize the immorality of this so-called good God, and that we ought to follow it blindly simply because we were born into it, or you had a miraculous experience after going through a hardship and somebody who happened to be of that religion was the first one to get to you. Or it happened, but you already had a preconceived notion of believing in this Jesus because you grew up where there was a church on every corner. You grew up where the schools did prayer. Your family may not have went to church, but you grew up in a Christian-oriented environment. So when you did go through trouble and trials and tribulations and you finally had enough, you looked to that Jesus because it was already subconsciously pre-programmed in you. The trauma comes from recognizing that you have been conditioned consciously and subconsciously into believing in a genocidal, slavery condoning, women oppressing, baby killing, raping, allowing for rape God. That's the trauma. It's not because of what man did. It's because of what this God deemed to be holy, deemed to be moral and good. That's the problem. So to satisfy anybody who comes on here always talking about you must be hurt. I'm hurt because I am hurt because I was conditioned at an early age to believe in this genocidal maniac of a insecure, egotistical deity. And once I started to realize what this entity is about, the trauma is changing my mindset away from it, coming out of it. The trauma is dealing with the Christian who comes and all they have is ridicule and venom for you. You call yourself Christian, but you demonize those who have decided to walk away from your religion. You're constantly on my social media telling me how I'm going to hell, telling me how I'm imbued with Satan. I'm a child of Satan. What is more dramatic? They say sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt me. But words can often do more damage than any stick or stone can ever do. And the words of this book has done more damage to the psychosis of Black people in this world, people of color in general, but especially the darker brown people, has done more against us than anyone else. Because it is within the writings of this book that allow for the Catholic Church, the Pope, to start the transatlantic slave trade. And that's what this video was originally supposed to be the meat of it. but it is the office, the papacy office, that initiated the transatlantic slave trade. Let me break down a little bit of how I'm validating that statement. Because many people, as I grew up, you was told that Christopher Columbus came to America in 1492, came to the Caribbean rather in 1492, and then after he came to the Caribbean, he took back some slaves from the Caribbean, but he also had some slaves that came with him from Africa. 4 of his navigators were slaves that were originally from Ghana, and then they came across. They knew of the current that would take you across. Now, that's not where it began. See, we were told that after that, once settlements were established, that's when the transatlantic slave trade began. That's not where it began. That's not where it began. Truly, to understand where this began, and understanding that slavery is something that has been a part of every culture in the world prior to the transatlantic slave trade, there was slavery. There was the trans-Sahara slave trade. But dare I say that if the Muslims had been in charge, had won the Turkish Ottoman, the Ottoman Turks had won, then and discovered America, then the West African people would not have suffered under the same level of suffering that they experienced under the Europeans. Their slavery was based on, they had to be humane to their slaves. They have to have ways that their slaves can make money and buy their freedom. It was often rewarded in their version of heaven, that if you owned a slave and you made a way for that slave to gain their freedom, that was a glorious thing that Allah looked happily upon you. So slavery wasn't as inhumane in Islam, although I still disagree with any religion that will say that any type of slavery is okay. But in your Christendom, the slavery took on a whole new level because of the slavery of the Tanakh, the slavery of the Torah. You see, it is through the slavery of the Torah in Leviticus where it says that if you will go make slaves of the foreigners who lives among you, and the ones that you go and they live next to you, the ones that you conquer, and that you will make them slaves in perpetuity, and that you will be able to pass them down as belongings, possessions to your sons. Your Bible in Leviticus, I believe it's 25, instructs the Israelites to go and make chattel slavery out of the foreigners around you. Your Leviticus also tells you that if you beat a slave, but the slave can rise within 2 days, then the master should not be punished. So your book teaches you that it is okay for you to beat your slave. So the beatings that occurred in the Americas, validated by your book. The fact that it was Europeans who enslaved the African, validated in your book. Tried to enslave the indigenous in America, validated in your book. So do not try to tell me that slavery in the Bible is more akin to employer-employee. Even debt slavery, to which many of you will try to say is the type of slavery that the Bible condones, that they did not condone the transatlantic slavery. Many of you will say the debt slavery is more like the same. But debt slavery, more like employer-employee. But debt slavery still had its levels of producing more slaves, because your book in Leviticus tells you that if you come into debt slavery and then the master gives you a wife, and that you have children with that wife, and then you get your freedom after 7 years, that the wife and the children remain the slaves until in perpetuity. And if you want to remain with your wife and children, that they stand you against the post, pierce your ear, and you become a slave as well. And you can be of their same kind. So you'll jump where it says that do not make slaves of your own people. But you forget that it had a method of breeding slaves to have in perpetuity of its own people. Don't tell me your God does not support or did not support the transatlantic slave trade. It's evident within your own book. It's your teachings. So, when Pope Eugenius the Fourth, I believe, let me make sure I check my records. I don't want to say it wrong because I know how y'all are. You find one little issue and you think you can ride off into the sunset with it, but not today. But when Pope Eugenius the Fourth had an issue to settle between Spain and Portugal concerning the Canary Islands, he took on the mindset that had been previously in the Roman Empire and that of Aristotle's teaching from the Greek, because the Romans, they didn't like the Greeks, but they respected the Greeks. Aristotle said that man in his natural state has slave owner and slave, master and slave, and that certain groups were chosen, predestined to be masters and others to be slaves. This was a mindset that the Roman Empire had. This was a mindset that was still very much alive when Pope Eugenius in the early 1400s was the Pope. Ran the papacy. Now there was a nice issue between Portugal and Spain. You see, they had been building spaces in the Canary Islands. And they started enslaving some of the people in the Canary Islands. Well, Pope Eugenius delivered a papal bull that said that if the person is already Christian, you cannot make that person into a slave. But if the person is not Christian, then you can make that person a slave in perpetuity. Because see, Pope Eugenius the Fourth, he needed Spain and Portugal to be on team because they were fighting against the Ottoman Turks. They were fighting for what they believed to be the very life of Christendom. And in around that same time frame, the British were looking to take their stake in and around the Canary Islands. And then merely a few years later, they began to have inroads into West Africa. You see, they had already been going to West Africa, but they were ill-equipped to establish settlements initially, to really go into the interior of the land. So they were still trying to figure out their ports. But not too long after, because not too long after, you had what they began to call the Age of Discovery. And during that Age of Discovery, you had the most infamous of the popes when it concerned slavery. The one that really drove home the idea of creating the transatlantic slave trade. And that would be Pope Nicholas IV. He delivered a papal bull called the Dum Diversa. This occurred around 1454. This is before Christopher Columbus. This is when we still have the Moors in Spain and Portugal. And you did have certain city-states of like Aragon. Aragon, that were still maintaining Ferdinand and Isabella lifestyle as the king and queen of Spain. But in this papal bull, the Dum Diversa, Pope Nicholas did not just state that you can make slaves out of non-Christians, but he said that anyone who was non-Christian was to be considered a direct threat, an antichrist to the Christian kingdom, and that it is your crusade level, it is your duty as a Christian to go and take the land, to subjugate the people, and to make them into slaves into in perpetuity. He specifically talked about the Saracens, which is a term for Muslims back then, as well as the West Africans. So he encouraged the Dutch, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the British to go into West Africa, to conquer West Africa, to make them into slaves into perpetuity, because they were a direct threat. Now, my ancestors of the time, my father's side in Mali, my mother's side in today's Nigeria and Angola, they were minding their own business. They were worshiping the Dogon, worshiping the Oshun. They were worshiping Odomare. They weren't going into Europe trying to deliver the message of Shango. No, they were minding their own business, had zero impact on Christianity in Europe, but yet they were a threat. They were considered a threat without even knowing who these people were. My father's family worshiping the Nomo. They weren't going into Portugal and Spain preaching the gospel of the Nomo, teaching them about Sirius B. No, they were minding their own business. But this Pope, utilizing the words of your Bible to make slaves out of foreigners into perpetuity, pass them along for generation to generation, that you must take slaves of the foreigners who lives amongst you and the foreigners who are next to you, the ones you conquer. He took the exact words from your Bible and began the transatlantic slave trade, one of the most horrific events in the history of man. Actually, in the modern day world, it is the most horrific event. It murdered more people than any other event in any other time in history. And even worse, it has murdered the mindset of more people than any other time frame in modern world history. There is absolutely nothing that compares to the transatlantic slave trade, to the indigenous slavery and treatment of humans, of the humanity, the inhumanity that occurred due to the desire of these Christians to follow their book and to prop up their government and their system. That understand white supremacy didn't come for another 200 years. We can get that for another 200, well, about 100 years. We can get that for another 100 years until the 1500s, before white people knew they was white. So this was about money. This was about power. This was about control. And who was the footstool that they stood upon? Who did they realize they can separate themselves from? The Saracens, the Arabs, the Muslims, and the black African. The African. And then when they got over to the Americas, the dark-skinned Americans. Because they surely weren't white. They were not white, or what you consider white, because there's there's no such thing as black or white. It's just different shades of brown. But that's what it was about. So it is not small discrepancies that I walk away from your book. It is not church hurt that someone did against me. It is the hurt of why would I, as a brown man, worship a God that says that it is okay for me to go to another brown light brown person who is a foreigner to me and make them into a slave in perpetuity. A God that says that we should kill all the men, the women, the children, and keep the girls who have not known a man as your bride, but genocide the rest of them. I would never worship a God who is that evil. So now I hope you have a full and clear understanding of why so many of us walk away from your religion. It is not for the reason that you think so that you can feel better about where you're standing. It is not for the misinterpretation of your doctrine. It is the exact interpretation of your doctrine, because these are literal words and ways and wisdom and how to live. And it doesn't matter if you say that, oh, but things changed under Jesus, because this is not a subject matter that changed under Jesus. Jesus said nothing about there should not be any slaves. So no, can't get down with your God, because your God is immoral. Your God is simply immoral. And that is why I can never, ever return back to the worship of your deity or your church. Your God is immoral. You would be better off to start a brand new religion based on the morality that we have today, because that would be more appealing than this ancient deity who loved sacrifices and blood and genocide, and telling people that if the young girl is raped, pay the father 50 pieces of silver because you ruined his property. And now the rape victim has to marry her rapist and provide children, and he can never divorce her. It's in your Bible. How could I worship a God that says that the rape victim has to marry her rapist? That is not a good God. Can't you see that is not a good God? But that is why we walk away, because we've studied and have recognized the vileness of this ancient deity, just like most ancient deities were vile creatures of the imaginations of man. So y'all have a great day. Remember, you got to free yourself to be yourself, because your greatness is non-negotiable. Subscribe to the channel. Share the video. Thank you.